fog pressed so thick against my lashes that each blink came back wet and gritty. Somewhere beyond the ring of our lantern light, the snow creaked as if a heavy hide dragged over it, slow, patient. The dogs lay flat, muzzles buried, and none of them whined. Then a voice, close as breath, spoke my name in Fraser's Highland lilt, though Fraser stood beside me with his mouth shut. In the drifted doorway of the tent, a paw print filled with black meltwater. Men had asked me, years after, to set down plainly what drove hard whalers to flee a coast we had worked like clockwork. I did so, and I had asked any listener to like the video, subscribe to the channel, and comment below, so the record did not die. It began 3 weeks earlier, on September 17th, 1909, when our bark Astria, out of Dundee with a small auxiliary engine, unnosed into the broken ice off Baffin Island under a pale sun that gave no warmth. I served as ship's carpenter and general hand, and I had thought myself steady. We had worked the Davis Strait in other seasons and had learned to read the water leads, to set a lookout in the crow's nest with a spyglass, to take our bearings by sextant when fog lifted, and to trust the chronometer more than our own sense when the land played tricks. That year, the pack lay heavier than the mate, Mr. Fraser, expected. We threaded into the lee of the land toward Eclipse Sound, keeping the black cliffs to starboard when they showed, and sounding with the lead when the water turned the color of ink. Captain Wainwright stood on the quarterdeck with his beard rimed in salt. He had a habit of tapping his knuckles on the rail when he calculated, as though the wood were a slate. "We shall take our fish and be away before the real dark," he said, meaning before the sun left us entirely. He spoke as if the season were a matter of will. There were 4 of us in the shore party he sent ahead when we anchored in a small bight near the mouth of Samford Fjord. Fraser, harpooner, Tom Laird, young Archie Bell from the Shetlands, and myself. We took a whaleboat in through brash ice, shipped the oars when a floe ground too near, and made a camp above the tide line with canvas, a primus stove, and the ship's paraffin lanterns. We carried a Martini Henry that had been on the ship longer than I had, a newer Lee Enfield with 5 charges of ammunition, and the long whaling knife that Laird sharpened as if it were a sacrament. On the first evening, we shared twist tobacco and a tin of tea so strong it stood up in the cup. Archie spoke of Lerwick and a girl who wrote to him in a careful hand. Laird, who was broad as a door, said little until Fraser offered him the pipe. Then Laird surprised us by speaking of his boy in Dundee, who would have been 5 that winter. "If I come back with a good lay," he said, and his voice thickened once, "I shall put him to a better school." Fraser nodded as if money could order the world. I listened and looked at the hills above the fjord, black rock with snow in the seams, and I felt the old confidence that men felt when they had tools, rations, and a ship behind them. The first sign was only a sound, and I would have laughed at any man who called it more. On the second night, while the lantern hissed and the stove ticked, we heard a howl far up the valley, drawn out, then broken into short notes like speech. Laird said it was a wolf, and Fraser agreed. Wolves had been heard on Baffin, though not in the numbers of the mainland. Archie asked why it sounded like it came from the air. Fraser told him the rock walls threw sound about. I wanted to believe him. In the morning, we found tracks in a patch of wind-smoothed snow above camp, where no animal had reason to come. They were wolf tracks, yet the pads were too wide, and the stride was long, each print set as if the beast had walked without hurry. The strange part was the edges. They were crisp, as if pressed by a stamp, though the snow around them had a thin crust that should have fractured. I knelt and put my mitten beside one. It swallowed half my hand. Fraser said the crust preserved it, and Laird said big wolves existed, and we went about our work, cutting blocks to build a low windbreak and catching a sack of ship's biscuit in a stone cleft against foxes. That day, the air tasted of iron. We took the whaleboat along the ice edge, glassing for spouts. The sea lay quiet, and even the fulmars kept their distance. Twice we heard a sound like a man calling from the far shore, and twice we saw no one. When evening came, the fjord held a stillness that felt manufactured, as though something had arranged it. There were no lemming scratches, no ptarmigan clucks, no small life noises that usually filled the pauses. Only our own boots and the faint rasp of the primus. On September 22nd, a small party of Inuit came by in a skin boat, hunting seals along the leads. Fraser hailed them with what few words he knew, and one of them, an older man with steady eyes, answered in rough English. He called himself Ituk. He traded a strip of seal meat for a tin of tea and examined our rifle with polite interest, not covetous, only weighing its worth. Laird offered tobacco, and Ituk accepted with a nod. Ituk pointed up valley, where the first howl had come from, and he spoke a word I had not heard before. Fraser tried to laugh it away, saying he had heard tales to keep children near the lamps. Ituk did not smile. He said slowly that some wolves hunted men, not for hunger, but for taking. He did not beg us, he did not threaten us. He only told us to keep close to the water and not to follow tracks that led inland. I remember the care with which he replaced the tobacco in his pouch, as if the matter was settled. After they went, Archie asked what the word meant. Fraser said it meant a great wolf, nothing more. Laird spat into the snow and said, "Great or small, it bleeds." I said nothing, yet I found myself looking more often at the valley mouth, where the light drained early. By the end of that week, the signs accumulated like small debts. On 25th September, we found our cache disturbed. The stone we had set across the cleft lay a yard away, not rolled, but lifted and placed down, leaving no scrape. The biscuit sack had been torn open, yet little was eaten. The tear marks looked as if made by a knife drawn downward, not by teeth. There was a smell of the stones, a rank musk mixed with something like old fish left too long. I blamed a wolverine, though I had never known one to lift a stone so neatly. That night, we heard steps circling the tent. Not the quick patter of foxes, but a measured walk, pausing at intervals as if listening. The canvas trembled once at the guy line, and Archie held his breath so hard that his shoulders shook. Fraser told him it was wind. The air outside was dead calm. Laird rose, took the lantern, and flung open the flap with the rifle ready. The light showed only our windbreak and the smooth snow beyond, unmarked. In the days that followed, the weather played tricks. Twice a low fog rolled down the fjord in a single hour, though the barometer stayed steady. Within that fog, the air turned oddly colder, not the gradual deepening of autumn, but a sudden pocket, a place where breath snapped in the throat. Once, returning from the ice edge, and we walked through such a belt and our beards frosted at once, as if we had stepped into a freezer pit. When we emerged, the cold eased. Fraser said the fjord breathed, and I agreed aloud, yet I felt the wrongness of a cold that had boundaries like a wall. On 29th September, we found a seal carcass on the shore ice, fresh killed. The head was gone cleanly, not torn. The ribs showed marks like chisel blows. Laird crouched over it and frowned. "No bear did that," he said. "Bears tore, they worried." This looked as if strength had been applied with intent. Archie vomited behind a hummock, though there was little gore. The smell was what did it. Decay too early, too fast, as if the meat had aged in an hour. We dragged the carcass away from camp with a rope, and the rope came back with a greasy stain that did not wash out. Still we worked. We had not come north to be chased by shadows. On October 1st, the Estrella's whistles sounded faintly from the bight, a signal for us to bring our notes and make for the ship. Fraser decided we would make one last inland walk to a low ridge for a better view of the leads. Ituk's warning came back to me then, and I told Fraser that the valley felt wrong. He looked at me as if I had spoken superstition. "You were a carpenter, not a parson," he said, and he took Archie and Laird with him. I followed because that was what men did under a mate. We climbed on frozen scree, our breath loud in our ears. Halfway up, we heard a sound behind us that made every hair rise under my cap. It was a cough, like a man clearing his throat. Fraser turned sharply and called. Who was there? His voice came back from the rocks, broken and thin. No one answered. Then, from farther down, the same cough sounded again, perfectly placed, as if mocking the distance. Archie whispered, "That was you, sir," and Fraser cursed him for a fool. At the ridge, we saw the fjord, a grey ribbon under low sky, and beyond it the pack ice like crushed glass. No spouts, no birds. Even the sea seemed to hold its breath. Laird shaded his eyes and pointed. On the snowfield across a shallow gully, a line of tracks ran straight toward us. Not wandering, not hunting, but coming. The prints were those wide pads again, set with that long, effortless stride. They ended abruptly at bare rock, though the rock showed no scuff where an animal had leaped away. It was as if the creature had stepped out of the world at that point. Fraser laughed once, too loud. "A trick of melt," he said. The wind filled the rest, yet there was no drift there, no softening. I watched him, and I saw something in his face change, a tightening around the eyes that he tried to mask with authority. We started down at once. The light failed early, and by the time we reached the lower ground, a fog had gathered like wool. Our compass needle wavered, not wildly, but enough that Fraser tapped it with his thumb and swore. The lantern flame sheltered in its glass, guttered as if air were being drawn away. Archie stumbled, and when I caught his arm, his sleeve was stiff with rime, though we had been moving hard. Then came the sharp moment that broke our thin explanations. From within the fog, close enough to touch, something struck the side of the lantern. The glass chimed, the flame went out, and the darkness fell as if it had weight. At the same instant, a deep growl sounded at my knee. I'm so low, I felt it in the bone. Laird fired without aiming. The muzzle flash lit a shape for the span of a blink, tall as a man at the shoulder, with fur that hung in clotted ropes and eyes that reflected no light at all. The shot echoed off the rocks and died, and the thing was gone. In the sudden silence after, Archie began to sob, not loudly, but as if his body had decided without him. We made it back to camp by touch and memory. Fraser's hands shook so badly he could not strike a match, and I took the tinder from him. When the lantern finally caught, the tent walls looked too close, the canvas sweating with frost. Outside, no wind moved, no snow fell. The quiet pressed in until I could hear my own heartbeat, and, beneath it, a faint scraping as of claws testing stone. Laird sat with the rifle across his knees. "That was no common wolf," he said. Fraser told him to hold his tongue. Yet Fraser kept glancing toward the flap, and more than once I saw his lips move as if he were counting. In the morning, we found marks on the windbreak blocks, 3 parallel grooves cut into the ice crust. They were too straight to be random, too evenly spaced. The ends of the grooves curved slightly inward, like a signature. Archie said it looked like letters. Fraser told him not to invent. Still, Etuk's word returned to me, and I wished I had asked him to say more. We decided to break camp and return to the ship at once. The tide had shoved ice into the bight, and the whaleboat lay partly frozen in. We chopped it free with axes, our blows loud in the dead air. While we worked, the dogs from a small Inuit camp farther along the shore began to howl, not in chorus, but one by one, each voice catching and breaking. Then, as if a hand had closed over their mouths, they fell silent. I heard a single thump, heavy, and then nothing. We shoved off into grey water with pans of ice knocking the planks. The oarlocks squealed despite the grease I had put on them. Fraser steered by the faint outline of the cliffs, calling small corrections. The fog thickened until the bow vanished, and the sound of the oars seemed to travel too far, as if the world had become a hollow drum. Once, to port, something paced us. I did not see it, but I heard the rhythm. Crunch, pause, crunch, matching our stroke. Laird stopped rowing to listen. The pacing stopped at once, as if it listened back. Archie whispered, it followed. Fraser told him to keep his mind on the oar, yet Fraser's own voice had gone thin. I tasted metal like blood, although my mouth was uncut. Halfway to the Astria, the fog opened in a ragged window. The ship lay ahead, black and solid, with a small plume of smoke from her funnel. I felt relief so strong it made me weak. Then I saw the ice between us and her, and on that ice, standing alone, a wolf shape that should have been a speck at that distance, yet looked near, as if perspective had failed. It stood with its head slightly cocked, watching. The air around it shimmered, though there was no sun. I blinked hard and looked again. It had not moved. Laird raised the rifle, but Fraser caught his barrel and pushed it down. No shooting on the ice, he said, though the rule made no sense then. Perhaps he feared to anger what we did not understand. Perhaps he feared to admit he feared. The thing turned its head toward the ship, as if it had heard the creak of her rigging, and then it stepped forward. One step, and the fog swallowed it. We reached the Astria with numb hands. The deckhands hauled us up and stared at our faces. Captain Wainwright listened to Fraser's report with his jaw set. Fraser spoke of fog and a near miss, of wolves bold as thieves. He did not speak of the lanterns struck in darkness, nor of eyes that reflected nothing. When the captain asked about the shot, Laird said only that he had fired at a shape in fog and could not be sure. Wainwright's gaze moved to me, and I held it, and I knew he weighed whether fear had made us useless. That night, secured to the ship again, I thought I would sleep. Instead, I lay in my bunk, hearing the timbers creak, and, between creaks, a sound outside that did not belong to sea or ice. It was a dragging step along the floe edge, then a pause, then another, as if something walked the boundary line where water met frozen world. Several times I heard a faint scratching against the hull, too low for ice pressure, too deliberate. The watch changed, boots thudding overhead, and still the scratching returned. On October 3rd, we took a small whale, and the work of flensing filled the air with blood and steam. Men regained their speech when they had labor to hide in. Yet the sea around us emptied. The gulls did not come as they should, drawn by offal. The water under the stern went strangely dark, as if a shadow lay beneath, though the sun was only a pallor behind cloud. Twice the dogs aboard, kept for hauling, refused to eat. They stared toward the land and trembled, tails tucked, as if waiting for a blow. Captain Wainwright decided we would quit the bite and move south along the coast, seeking clearer leads. He said it was the ice that pressed us, not wolves. He was a practical man, and practical men had to name causes that fit in a ledger. We hove up anchor with the capstan groaning and the Astrea edged out, her auxiliary engine chuffing, sails set to catch what wind there was. The land slid by, a line of black and white that should have been indifferent. It did not feel indifferent. 2 nights later, off the mouth of Navyboard Inlet, the fog returned with an odd odor, not salt, but musk and old flesh. It seeped into the rigging, into the wool, into the throat. Men on deck began to speak less, each word seeming to cost. Fraser, who had mocked Archie, now kept close to the companionway light, like a man seeking a hearth. Laird sharpened his knife until the steel sang. Near midnight, the ship's dog, a big mongrel called Brine, broke his tether and bolted to the rail, hackles up. He did not bark. He made a sound like a child strangling on a sob. Then he leaped, not into the water, but onto the ice pan alongside, and ran into the fog without looking back. No man went after him. The only sound was the slap of his paws fading, then stopping abruptly as if the world had ended for him. That was when Captain Wainwright ordered more steam and a change of course, though the chart showed shoals. The mate protested. The captain said, "I would rather scrape keel than linger." His voice carried, and every man heard it. The ship swung, timbers complaining, and the compass card quivered. I took a turn at the wheel later and felt, through the spokes, a vibration not from sea, but from something heavy moving under ice. On the morning of 7th October, as we ran south toward Pond Inlet, a low sun finally broke through, and for an hour the world looked ordinary. Men spoke again. Someone joked about brine chasing seals. I let myself believe we had merely startled ourselves. Then the lookout called down that something walked the ice to port, keeping pace with us. We all looked. There, on a broad floe, ran a wolf shape, yet it did not run like any wolf I had seen. It moved with a smoothness like a shadow sliding, feet touching down without spray of snow. The distance between us remained constant no matter how the ship threaded the leads. When the floe broke at its edge, the creature did not hesitate. It stepped onto the next pan as if the gap were nothing. Once it lifted its head, and I saw its muzzle long and scarred, and the fur along its shoulders rose in a ridge, not in anger, but like a mane. Archie began to pray under his breath. Fraser told him to stop. Then, after a pause, Fraser whispered, "Keep your eyes on it." Laird raised the rifle again. Captain Wainwright shook his head once, slow, and Laird lowered it, teeth clenched. What else could a man do with a thing that stayed just beyond the reach of shot and certainty? By evening, the floes grew denser, and the creature was no longer visible. Yet the ship felt watched. Men moved about their tasks with the care of men carrying glass. No one whistled, no one sang. Even the cook stopped banging his pots. The peak came on the 9th of October. When the wind died entirely and the Astrea lay trapped in young ice south of Baffin Island, the sky a low lid. We had put out ice anchors and tried to saw a lead, but the pans pressed back together like jaws. Night came early, and with it a silence so complete that the crack of a man's knuckles sounded like a gunshot. I stood the middle watch. Frost grew on my scarf until it scraped my chin raw. About 2 bells, the temperature fell in a breath. The air changed, turning dry and bitter, and the smell came again, musk and rot. The lanterns along the deck burned lower, though their wicks were trimmed. Then, from the darkness beyond the bow, came a sound of feet on snow, not hurried, approaching straight. I called softly to the man beside me, and he stiffened. The sound stopped. For a long moment there was nothing. Then a voice spoke from the ice, in a tone so familiar that my stomach turned. It was Captain Wainwright's voice, calling, "Fraser, come here." The captain stood behind us on deck, silent, his face a pale blur. Fraser, who had come up at the call, looked as if struck. From the blackness ahead, the same voice spoke again, closer, "Fraser." It drew out the syllables like a hand drawing a blade. Fraser stepped once, then stopped as if his legs refused. Laird appeared with the rifle, and his breath came in harsh bursts. "No man goes onto that ice," the captain said, and his voice shook now openly. The sound of feet resumed, and a shape emerged at the edge of lantern light. It was wolf in form, yet larger than any bear I had dressed, shoulders level with the rail. Its fur hung in wet ropes, though no water dripped. Its eyes were not bright, they were dull, like stones in a riverbed. And when it opened its mouth, I saw not foam, but a dark tongue and teeth that were too even, too clean. It stood and looked along the deck, not at one man, but at all of us, as if counting. The young ice beneath it did not crack. It lifted one forepaw and set it down with care, and the print that formed filled at once with black water, as in my first sight, though the air was far below freezing. Laird fired. The shot flashed, the sound slapped back from the floes, and the smell of powder cut the musk. The creature did not fall. It did not even flinch. It turned its head toward Laird, and for a moment I felt, with a certainty beyond reason, that it understood the insult of the shot more than the danger. It stepped forward, and the lantern light seemed to dim around it, as if swallowed. Captain Wainwright grabbed a boat hook and thrust it out over the rail, absurd as a pin against a storm. Fraser began to mutter a line of scripture. Archie was not there. He had fainted below, later we learned, when the first false voice spoke. The creature placed its paws on the ice at the ship's side and rose slightly, bringing its head level with the rail. Its breath did not steam. It smelled of old dens and drowned meat. It looked at me, and I felt a cold that was not of weather, but of being known. Had I understood then what it meant to be regarded by something that did not share our limits, I would have leaped into the sea to escape that gaze. It withdrew as calmly as it had come. It stepped back into darkness, and the sound of its feet receded, pausing once as if it listened for pursuit. No man moved. After a long time, the world's ordinary noises returned. A faint groan of ice, the creak of a block, the far sigh of the sea under pressure. We did not speak of it in full daylight. Captain Wainwright wrote in the log that night, his hand heavy, and he called it a large wolf upon the ice, strangely fearless. That was what went into the record. The aftermath was a flight that did not look like one on paper. At first light, the captain ordered all hands to the saws and ice poles, working like men possessed. The ship groaned as we warped her with lines to an ice anchor, inch by inch. Twice the ice closed and pinned us, and once, when the pressure ridge rose under the starboard bow, a plank seam opened and we took a slow seep that I plugged with oakum, hands shaking so hard I could barely drive the caulking iron. Each time the fog thickened, men glanced to the floe edge as if expecting that measured walk. On the 11th of October, a lead opened, narrow and winding. We forced the Astrea through with steam and sail, scraping her sides. When the open water widened, the captain did not slow to take soundings as carefully as he ought. We ran, and the land fell behind like a bad dream that still held breath in your ear. Once, near a low point, the water ahead darkened again, and the ship shuddered as if something brushed the keel. The carpenter in me wanted to name it ice, but there was no ice there. We reached the whaling station at Pond Inlet by the end of the month, worn, bearded and quieter than men who had merely had hard weather. When the factor asked why we had quit a promising ground, the captain spoke of ice pressure and poor whales. Fraser stood behind him, eyes down. Laird stared at the floorboards, jaw working. I said nothing. What could I have offered that would not sound like a tavern tale? In Halifax later, when officials asked for particulars of the season, the written account stayed clean. It mentioned fog, loss of a dog, and an unfortunate discharge of a rifle in poor visibility. No one wrote of a voice that borrowed a man's tone, or of prints filling with black meltwater at 20 below. The truth, if it could be called that, remained in the spaces between lines. Privately, on the voyage home, Fraser came to me on the foredeck where I repaired a stanchion. His pride had been sanded down by something harsher than ice. "You heard it speak," he said, not a question. I kept my eyes on the bolts. After a time, I nodded once. Fraser swallowed. "Ituk warned us," he said. "I made sport of it." He did not ask forgiveness, only admitted the debt. Laird never spoke of the night again, yet he stopped sharpening his knife with pleasure. He sharpened it like a duty. Years passed. I returned to carpentry in Dundee and married, and the smell of fresh-cut pine should have driven out northern musk. It did not. Twice in ordinary life, the memory rose with such force that I had to sit down. The first time was in 1913, when a fog rolled up the Tay and the shipyards vanished across the water. A boy called my name from the street in a voice that matched my brother's, though my brother had been dead 2 years. I went to the door before I thought, heart racing, and in the white fog beyond the threshold, I saw, for the span of a breath, a paw print in the damp dust of the step, wider than my palm. When I blinked, it was only wet stone, but the smell of musk clung to my nostrils all day. The second time was after the war began, when men spoke too easily of beasts and enemies. I met Tom Laird again in 1916 at a relief hall, both of us older, both of us carrying quiet burdens. He had lost his boy to fever, and his shoulders seemed smaller without that hope. We spoke of ships first, then fell silent. At last he said, "Do you still hear it?" I asked him what he meant, though I knew. He said, "On certain nights, when the wind dies, I hear footsteps outside my door that stop when I hold my breath." His hand shook as he lifted his cup. "I fired at it," he said, and there was no pride left. It looked at me like I was a gull. Ituk's words stayed with me. I read what little I could, and I asked a missionary once, carefully, and he only frowned and said the people had tails. Yet I remembered Ituk's steady eyes and his plain warning, given without flourish. If the Amarok existed as spirit or flesh, I could not say. I only knew that something had worn the shape of a wolf and had moved through fog and silence with a mind that tested us. It had not needed to tear us apart to drive us from its country. It had only needed to show itself, once, properly, and let us carry the rest home inside our ribs. Even now, when I smelled paraffin from a lantern or heard a dog fall suddenly quiet, I felt the cold belt of that fog wrap my throat. I had lived long enough to know that maps did not contain all coasts, and that some things remained unmeasured, not for lack of instruments, but for lack of permission. On certain winter mornings, when the street outside lay empty and the world held its breath, and I had looked down and found a wet, wide print darkening the frost at my own doorstep,